Hello, 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 and welcome back to our Radical Mathematicians podcast. This episode, we are going to be talking about George Boole, 19th century English mathematician.
Disclaimer, in the Radical Mathematicians podcast, you will not hear professional podcasters, professional mathematicians, professional historians, or any radicals.
That was your expertise from Doug. Introduce yourself. Hello.
I'm Sydney's dad.
Yes.
It's the Doug and Sydney show.
That is how he is defining himself. I'm Sydney. That's my dad. Yes, let's get started. George Boole. Anyway, let's talk about that guy. He was born in
1815.
He died in
1864.
He lived
age
to
49, I think.
Age 49.
Of pneumonia, a life cut short. Born in England, died in Ireland.
He was born in Lincoln, England, to a relatively poor family. His dad had been in prison for debt and was a shoemaker, I believe.
That's right. And a very poor businessman.
Yes, a very poor businessman.
Who could have had a successful business, but he was more interested in making telescopes and studying optics, and he was a little absent-minded.
The whole family situation seems like it was a really good place for George Boole, little smart mathematician guy to grow up in. His dad was super bad at business and apparently spent all his time making telescopes and optical instruments and teaching himself mathematics while he just kind of let the business go into ruin. And the whole thing collapsed when Boole was 16 years old because his dad just... Here's a quote. This is from his daughter. He seems to have been able to do anything well except his own business of managing the shop. So
the first thing you need to know about George Boole is he is a child prodigy, and quite a rare one, wouldn't you say?
I haven't met many child prodigies, but
he
does seem to be a little smarty pants.
He There's two interesting stories about him before he turned 16. One, he was a toddler, 3 or 4 years old, and apparently he wandered off from his caretaker and was found in a park downtown in a spelling competition with a group of adults. And then when he was 14, he translated a poem in Latin by a
Greek
famous poet. Wasn't it Latin?
Greek.
All right, let's say it was Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And it was translated so well that a professor of language, when it was published in the local paper, a professor of whether it was Greek or Latin, basically said it was a setup and there's no way that this 14-year-old could have translated this poem and it had to be some kind of trick. But it was really him. He was quite advanced. He learned, I think, Latin in school, and then he taught himself Greek, French, Italian, and German. That is true, just from a book. And it's no accident that he ultimately came to invent Boolean algebra, because logic and language are closely connected. And he had to drop out of school at 16, like you said, to save his father's, or to support his family after his business failed, his father's business.
The poem was called Ode to the Spring by the Greek poet Meleager.
Okay. I didn't read it. But I
did,
read the story.
I did read it. It sounded like a Greek poem.
So he learned a lot of math by borrowing textbooks. He met a few people who had access to libraries, and he read all the classics.
He said that he originally got into math because he had a very limited budget for buying books, and he wanted the books to last as long as possible. So his strategy was just to buy the hardest math textbooks he could find because it would take him a really long time to read it. More bang for your buck.
But he developed a very, very good knowledge of the math in those books. Some of his later papers, he starts out by summarizing the things that he eventually advanced. So when he was 16, he drops out of school and he becomes a teacher. And he teaches at a number of different tiny little private schools. These aren't the same kind of schools that exist now. This is 1825 or 30 or something like that. And when he's 19, he founds his own school.
He makes me feel bad about myself.
Or 20. He might have been 20.
I think he was 19. I have not founded my own school yet.
A very hard worker, very ambitious, very kind of an upright guy. Quite religious, kind of a free thinker, hardworking. Hardworking is definitely an adjective I'd use to describe him. He gave a speech, I believe, at his new school about Isaac Newton, and the speech was so well received that people asked him to publish it. And people actually went out and bought this pamphlet. And he was a student of Newton and a fan. Because he never went to university, he kind of muddled along for a while at his school. And then I think he expanded the school. But eventually, when he was 29 years old, he wrote a paper, and the paper got an award from the Royal Society. It was a paper on algebra, I think, and about 5 years after that, even though he was not educated past 16, he was offered a professorship of math at a new college in Ireland called Queen's College in Cork.
Yeah.
So he became the chair of mathematics at Queen's College. He was very well respected among English mathematicians for his papers. I think he actually he had the gold medal for the paper, and he published a book a couple years after that, a couple books. Or was it the first book, The Mathematical Analysis of Logic? And that was quite a consequential book, although it was short. And then he published another book later called An Investigation into the Laws of Thought, which was really the same subject, and it was much expanded. The first book is less than 100 pages, and then the second book is several hundred pages. He also published a very lengthy textbook on differential equations, which really summarized well all the body of knowledge. I don't know if it was used as a textbook, but I looked at it. It didn't appear to me to have like a lot of new theorems or anything like that, but it was a summary of all that was known about differential equations at that time. There may have been new work in there, but it was like 800 pages long.
He was really into, because he spent so long as a teacher.
Right.
He was really into math education.
Right. He was disappointed in the nature of the textbooks that existed. So he wrote this one, right?
I read some of his complaints about like the first textbook he ever learned from. And wow, he had a lot of complaints. I think he actually bonded with his wife over math education because she also had a lot of opinions. I guess she was educated in a pretty atypical manner about mathematics as well, mostly because she's a woman and didn't really have any opportunities. But they were both really into math education.
Another one of his friends and mentors was a guy who was a direct descendant of James Gregory, who we talked about a little bit in another podcast. The guy who he came up with an infinite series for pi, and yes, he worked in calculus. He was pre-Newton. Anyway, he had a descendant, may have been a great grandson, named Duncan Gregory, and he started a mathematics journal, one of the first ones, called the Cambridge Mathematical Journal, and many of Boole's papers were published there, and they were friends. He also was somebody who lent him a lot of library books because he didn't have any association with the university until he was 30. How old was he when he became a professor?
18.
He was 36 or something like that.
Yeah.
35 or 36. So if he had not been poor, he probably would have been a university professor like 15 years earlier.
He actually applied to, or he was considering doing an education, like a formal education, before he realized that if he went to Cambridge or Oxford, he was going to have to go back to the basics, and they wouldn't just let him directly jump into research. And he was like, I don't want to take that step back. I'm just going to keep studying independently.
And didn't he also complain that it would be very expensive?
I'm not sure about that, but I think his major concern was, well, maybe. He had to support his family for basically their entire lives. So that was also a major concern through his entire life. It's funny because if you read his application to initially be a professor at the university in Cork, he writes this application, and in the application he says, I am not a member of any university yet, and I have never studied at any college, which just like, that would never come up at the on an application to be a professor in 2021. Oh yeah, I've actually never stepped foot in a university, but I still want to be a professor. And then they actually took him. That's like, like the ultimate like alpha move. I don't even know how to. Well,
he was certainly sure of himself when it came to his scholarship, and he developed a reputation from these papers and mathematical work that he published.
He had a lot of good, I guess, testimonies.
It took a while, but he
applied to this university position, and he didn't receive a reply until 3 years later. I thought that the job applications I was sending out took a long time to get back to me. Like, 3 years. Imagine applying for a job and not getting a reply until 3 years later.
Well, I guess they were using the Pony Express, right? In those days.
I thought like Amazon was bad for getting back to me 3 months later.
He did very important stuff in differential equations. He wrote an important paper in what's now called invariant theory, but he called it his paper, he called it an exposition of a general theory of linear transformations, which was published in that Cambridge Mathematical Journal I mentioned. And most people say the theory of invariance, I actually have a quote from Weil. He says, the theory of invariance came into existence about the middle of the 19th century, somewhat like Minerva, mailed in the shining armor of algebra. She sprang forth from Cayley's Jovian head.
Well, so that's Cayley, not a pretentious quote at all.
Cayley, of course, developed the theory of invariance.
Can you go back to the quote? What does that mean? I don't recognize those words.
Well, I mean, it's a Greek myth. Minerva sprang from Zeus's head, supposedly.
Oh, Minerva. Who's Minerva?
Well, Minerva is
Is that Athena?
The Latin name for one of the gods. I can't remember. There's a Greek analog, but Jove is Zeus.
Oh.
So Zeus in Greek, Jove in Latin.
I thought it was Jupiter.
Jove, Jupiter, same thing.
Okay.
And you'll have to look up Minerva. Or maybe it was maybe it was also Minerva in Greek. But so Weil credits Cayley, but Cayley in his famous paper, which is literally named in a nod to Boole, because his paper is called On the Theory of Linear Transformations, which is almost the same title. In his paper, he says, in the first paragraph, he says, my investigations were suggested to me by a very elegant paper on the same subject by Mr. Boole. So it really, Cayley does develop the theory, but Boole, plants the seed in this paper. And invariant theory, in a way, you can think of the 18th century as a century of calculus, and the 19th century as a century of algebra. And the dividing line is kind of Boole.
What's invariant theory?
Oh, invariant theory, that's hard to explain. I'll just give you an analogy. You know how every matrix has a determinant?
Yeah.
So you can talk about the whole class of matrices that have, for example, a determinant of 1. It's a subset of all matrices, right? And since every matrix has a characteristic polynomial, you can talk about all the polynomials associated with all those matrices that have this invariant determinant. And every polynomial is defined by its coefficients. For like an n by n matrix, you're going to have n coefficients. So you can look to see, you have a class of polynomials, and they have something in common besides, the fact that they're characteristic polynomials of matrices that have determinant 1. You can look at their coefficients and say, what is it about their coefficients that groups them into one class? And it turns out their coefficients represent an algebra. So that's sort of the beginning of invariant theory.
Okay.
And you can study how their coefficients are related to one another, and it goes from there. And it has become very abstract. It eventually develops into cohomology, and anyway, it's hard to explain, but that's just one thing that's one idea that Boole had. That's not even the thing he's known for.
No, he's known for Boolean algebra.
Yes.
I know that.
So everybody knows that Boolean algebra is algebra with where the variables are only allowed to be 0 and 1. But that's not really what was new about it, and that's not really what was important about it. Although there's a sort of a key feature.
Was the connection that Boole made the fact that you can use Boolean algebra for any kind of logical reasoning?
Yes. So you really have to back up a lot to explain Boolean algebra, because it's motivated by something.
I'm sorry for jumping too far in there.
Should we talk about it now? Is this the good?
Yes,
I
don't know.
Moment in the podcast?
I don't know what the I don't know what started Boolean algebra.
Oh, all right. So the first thing I want to say about Boolean algebra is it was Boolean algebra, or what Boole created, is not really what's taught now as being Boolean algebra. It's not that
like
different.
Truth tables, things like that.
Yeah, it's not that different, and a lot of his critics, it turns out, actually really misunderstood it. Several of his critics said, well, Boole, of course, is a genius, and his Boolean algebra works perfectly, but...
I hate it.
They pointed out all these flaws, but they literally were not quite understanding what he was doing. And believe it or not, it wasn't until a paper was published in 1976 by a guy named Halperin, who figured out that what Boole was talking about when he said, no, I think part of the reason this was vague and misunderstood is because Boole, he came up with this idea before he ever became a professor. And he never he never had a formal math education. And even though he read a lot of math books, he made assumptions about things like classes and sets that were not standard assumptions that other mathematicians were making. They were subtle things, like little things, but it led people to misunderstand his algebra a little. And in 1976, this guy wrote this paper and he said, I've looked at all the historical criticisms, and it turns out that it really all hangs together if you just remember two things about Boolean algebra as Boole understood it. One is when he said that when he talked about sets or classes, Boole assumed that an element could appear twice in a what we today call a set. So today we don't do that, right? No. But for Boole, that was totally okay. And some people thought that led to a contradiction. But if you assume that you can have a single element appearing twice, then it all hangs together and it's perfect. And mathematicians have studied this. They're just slightly different objects. They call them multisets. And the other thing is, he assumed that you could have a multiplicity of these elements. So you could have actually, 5 of the same element in a set, or you could even have a negative number of elements in a set, which is sort of like having a deficit. So if you assume that Boole was thinking of what we today called an algebra of signed multisets, then this all works. And there was one other thing that people misunderstood is when Boole talked about a union of two sets. So you have a set A and a set B, right? And you create A or B. He specifically meant A or B, but not both A and B. So he was excluding the middle so he was using union in a slightly different way, and today we call that, I think, symmetric difference. So all that means is it's A or B, but not both A and B.
So if Boole's work was being misinterpreted for over 100 years,
but everybody knew that it led to the right answer,
why was it influential in Boole's time?
It was.
What was this man even doing?
It was influential because it worked and because of the idea of it. So in order to talk, these minor points aren't important, but it's just interesting to me that it really wasn't fully understood in the way that, for example, Boole understand differential equations.
Was it fully appreciated, though?
I don't know if I would say it was fully appreciated, but it certainly was recognized later as being very important. I mean, the thing about algebra and logic was there were a lot of people working on it. It was kind of in the air. There was, let me just go back to logic.
Let's get back to...
Because that will tell you what exactly Boole did that was new. So in Boole's time, nowadays we know that logic underpins math, and that logic and set theory are the axioms that all of math can be built upon. Mm. And a lot of modern logic is about studying different sets of axioms and studying the properties of systems of axioms and what that leads to, and so on, and things like completeness and satisfiability and things like that. But in Boole's time, it was not really clear whether logic underpinned math or math underpinned logic, It really,
chicken
in
and
fact,
the egg.
Boole really thought that math was more fundamental than logic.
How do you get more fundamental than logic?
That's what Boole thought. I mean, you have to remember, logic is not what we think of it today. Logic was Aristotle's logic. So Aristotle, there's really just 2 or 3 or 4 innovations in logic in history. So there was another school before Aristotle, but apparently all the work has been lost. There was this guy, see if I can find his name real quick, Chrysippus.
An ancient Greek guy?
An ancient Greek guy. He actually lived after Aristotle, I think, but his school, which was called the Stoic school, not Stoic like what you think, but just that's the name.
He wasn't just wandering around his school, just all Stoic-like.
Right, exactly.
Like refusing to make any expressions.
His Stoic school had been around for 100 years, and they had a theory of logic, and it was not Aristotle's theory. And the reason this guy Chrysippus is famous is because he was the most prominent member of this school, the Stoic school, and he supposedly wrote like 700 books, but they've all been lost. That's one system of logic. Aristotle also thought about logic, and he was interested in rational arguments, and he wrote a lot about this, and not just about logic. He was interested in how to do scientific thinking. He was interested in how to do what he would have called rational thinking or deductive thinking, right? Deductive argument. He was a student of Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates. Socrates famously had these dialogues where he would question people on their beliefs, and he would show the Socratic dialogues, and he would show them that sometimes they would logically lead to contradictions. And he tried to convince people to amend what they believed that way.
I'm sure that was very, very successful.
Yeah, exactly. Hemlock, right? So Aristotle wrote a lot of books about this. He was also interested in the relationship between ideas and thoughts and language and meaning. He also wrote at length because he was also interested in faulty reasoning, so he wrote a lot about fallacies. He wrote about probabilistic thinking, which now we might call modal logic, which is like still studied and researched. He also wrote about temporal thinking. But one of the things Aristotle wrote about that has been perhaps studied more intensively than almost anything else for 2,000 years is his syllogisms. And of course, today, syllogism is something that means something very specific, but I think Aristotle meant it just to mean deductive reasoning. So Aristotle analyzed rational argument, and he quite correctly broke it down into its component bits. And he said an argument is really just a series of claims, one after the other, which you can call propositions, and you can, at each stage, you can determine if that proposition or claim that you're making logically follows from the ones before. So if you have a long string of propositions in an argument, obviously it can be as complicated as you want, but if you really break it down into the simplest bits, you end up with, Aristotle thought, a series of syllogisms, which is a claim, and then another claim, and then a conclusion that combines those two. So you need at least 3 propositions. And this was the syllogism. And Aristotle was, focused in on the form of the proposition and not the meaning. He tried to separate. which of course is the proper way if you want to really understand how one proposition follows from another. So the best way I can explain this is by giving an example. There's a famous syllogism: all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay, that's like the classic example. Or as Boole would have put it, all y's are x's, all z's are y's, therefore all z's are x's. That's basically saying the same thing.
So Boole just put symbols to it.
Well, no, that's not what all he did, but that's just an example.
He made it more confusing.
No. I'll try and be brief. So Aristotle said, okay, so what is a proposition? He said the simple, you can break down propositions into its simplest form. It has to have at least two parts, and each part has two values. That means you have four possible propositions, types, right? Forms. And they are all x is y, some x is y, all x is not y, and some x is not y.
How is this contradicting he made it more confusing?
So this is actually called by, later scholars, I think it's called the fourfold way or something, because he identifies these four types of propositions that can be used in rational argument. The fourfold scheme. Is that what I said? Fourfold way? It's the fourfold scheme of propositions. And as you can imagine, if you have three of them, there are 64 possible combinations, right? So you can start to see this is becoming mathematical. So Aristotle examined this and he said, there are 24 combinations of these four forms of proposition in syllogisms that are legitimate rational conclusions from the two propositions that precede, which have names. I don't know if Aristotle gave them these names, but
all 24 of them.
All 24 of them have names. This is I think came later from medieval scholars, but the syllogism itself is, the first proposition is called the minor proposition, or the minor part, and the major part, and then the conclusion. So if you have 64 possible combinations, he said 24 of those are legitimate and 40 are fallacies, incorrect rational arguments. Obviously, some of them are just nonsense, but he did study the most common ones. I mean, nowadays, we have all kinds of weird fallacies, right? We have like straw man arguments. That's not what Aristotle was talking about.
There's a whole Wikipedia
He was
page.
talking about things like, if you're
angry with someone online, you can just link to that Wikipedia page if you're really passive aggressive about it.
So he would say something like, this is a bad argument.
Like an example of a bad argument?
All gods are immortal.
All men are immortal, therefore all men are gods.
That is a very good example of an illegitimate argument. Yes. So that would have been one of the 40 illegitimate ones. So this description of what a rational argument is was taken as doctrine for 2,000 years. It was just not questioned at all. It was just studied endlessly.
It was made by the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. They did no wrong.
Well, Aristotle was a pretty smart guy. So,
what were the medieval European scholars going to do? Contradict Aristotle?
Now, other people had studied this and worked on Aristotelian logic. And in fact, Pascal and a few others came up with an alternate form of logic, which is called Port Royal logic. I don't know much about it, but it was a thing in the 17th century.
Did Leibniz also come up with some sort of logic?
Yes, Leibniz did in fact do work on Aristotle's logic, and he did he actually had some of Boole's ideas about algebraizing it, but he never published, and his papers were not really...
Newton gets back. Yeah. I've never published. You don't get the credit.
From what I've read, his papers were really not recognized. His papers on logic, Leibniz's papers on logic, were not really recognized until 1900. This is more than 200 years after Leibniz died. So it didn't really have influence on people like Boole and Frege, who came after Boole. And other people
Leibniz pulling in
criticized
Newton by not
Aristotle.
Publishing.
But they had different ideas of what logic really was. For example, you know John Stuart Mill?
I know John Stuart.
John Stuart Mill was a very important thinker in the latter half of the 19th century in America. He was mostly a political philosopher, but he did study Aristotle's logic, and he came to the conclusion that everything, rational argument, was really not what Aristotle thought, that it really should be more inductive. But he was thinking of something else. He was thinking of really scientific thinking. This is not what Aristotle was talking about. So Pascal studied this in depth. Leibniz, before Leibniz was people like Roger Bacon, Thomas Aquinas, Hobbes. All these famous people studied Aristotelian logic in depth because it was about really logical thought. And if you were a philosopher, you cared about this stuff. Locke, Hegel, Kant, and then of course Boole had a bunch of contemporaries. There were Hamilton. There were actually two Hamiltons, both named William, both mathematicians and logicians, both contemporaries of Boole. I did not know this. There's William Sterling Hamilton, who is referred to as the Baronet, because he did some kind of genealogy. I think he was Irish, but he did some kind of genealogy and discovered that he was actually entitled to this baronet title. He was a baron, which nobody knew about because I can't remember something in his past. Somebody died young, and he made a claim, and he actually got this title.
Good for him.
Yeah. Well, I guess it helped him.
Do you have any
secure
hidden
a professorship or something
that we need to know about? I want to be entitled to something.
Total royalty. Anyway, the other Hamilton was William Rowan Hamilton, who is
the not baronet.
And Rowan Hamilton discovered quaternions, which is another part of algebra. Very famously, story about him. He was taking a walk and it just came to him.
Was this the bridge guy?
The bridge guy, yes, and it's carved into the bridge in Ireland today. And
I've heard
in
of
fact,
this
they
guy.
supposedly have like some kind of ceremony once a year, to celebrate the anniversary of this thing. It's some famous event. But quaternions, of course, are very important. And so some of Boole's contemporaries who studied logic, and there were a lot of people, De Morgan, Peirce.
De Morgan's law.
Yes, De Morgan's law. They were friends. And Boole, because he was not really like part of the academic world, he corresponded with a lot of, like every time he wrote a paper, somebody would write to him and say, "Oh, I read your paper, it was amazing," and he would correspond with a lot of different people. So he knew De Morgan and he knew both Hamiltons. In any event, that's a bit of a sideline. So Boole writes this paper or book, a short book, and he says, okay, so here's what Aristotle was talking about with his syllogisms, and he gives a very nice and accurate summary. And then he says,
but
no, he agrees with it. He doesn't have any criticism of Aristotle. But then he says, there's a reason why there are 24 legitimate, logically connected syllogisms and 40 that are illegitimate. And he wants to explain that. And he says, you can model these types of propositions in Aristotelian logic and the syllogisms with equations. It's not just the symbolism, it's the equations. And he says there's a whole algebra of this that you can write down in axioms, and it's a perfect model in mathematical equations of what Aristotle was talking about. Because Aristotle was just talking about form, right? Mm-hmm. And you can always model things that are just form and not meaning with models, and in this case, mathematical models. And he wrote down some axioms, and he described what he was talking about, and it worked perfectly.
Reasoning?
Yeah, symbolic reasoning. But nobody had done this before. I mean, Leibniz, I guess, but he didn't publish.
Pull the Newton there.
I didn't actually look up what it was Leibniz did, but he probably was along the same lines. So he said, if you can convert these propositions into symbolic expressions,
like ones and zeros.
No, not really ones and zeros, but symbols, which we call variables today, but
like
he
A,
called them
B,
symbols.
C.
And he basically turned propositions into polynomials. And the polynomials, when you have, so you have a system of two polynomials, right? The minor proposition and the major proposition. If you can derive the conclusion, which is also a polynomial, from the first two polynomials, and the equation evaluates to 1, then it is true. It is a legitimate deductive syllogism. If it evaluates to 0, then it's false. Yeah. Boole does this in his book, and it works perfectly. All the syllogisms that Aristotle discussed evaluate to 1 in this Boolean algebra, and all the false arguments evaluate to 0. He converts statements into polynomials, basically. And there are special kinds of polynomials. There are polynomials in this signed multi-set Boolean algebra of zeros and ones. But it works. He takes Aristotle and he converts it into a mathematical algebra or system. If you follow the axioms, it's completely mechanical. You don't have to like Thomas Aquinas, you don't have to refer to like God and meaning and infinity. It's just math.
And then it got used by...
Who
was the guy that used Boole's logic and converted it into electrical?
Oh, that came much later. That was Shannon.
But
yeah, he wrote a paper.
Shannon used Boole's logic,
right?
Converted it into electrical circuits, right?
He basically said that Boole's algebra is a good way to model electrical circuits, parallel circuits and series and in parallel, and it works.
And that led to computers. That's important.
Yeah, that is important. That's kind of remote, but yes, I mean that was sort of one step. I mean, yeah.
Isn't
it's just an application of Boole. It's not like if Boole hadn't existed, we wouldn't have computers, but it certainly was important. And of course, Boolean logic, this idea of, mathematicians studied base 2 for hundreds of years before Boole. It's not that he invented base 2 or anything. That's what people think, but that's really not it. That's not it. So after Boole came, of course, De Morgan was an important figure. He added to Boolean algebra with his De Morgan laws, and there was Venn diagrams came after. Set theory came after. And this guy who's now called the father of modern logic, Frege, came after about, 40 years after Boole. But Frege, of course, built on the idea of axioms. And he tried to apply it, instead of like looking backward to Aristotle, he was trying to apply it to all of mathematics. And that was kind of like a grand program that led to this book called Principia Mathematica. Have you ever heard of that?
The infamous one?
Yes.
Where
Russell and Whitehead.
It takes like 70 pages to deduct 2 + 2 = 4.
No. You're way off. It was 1 + 1 = 2, and it took 250 pages. But that was the program to try and put, just
formalize
as other
math.
people tried to put calculus on a rigorous footing and algebra on a rigorous footing, putting all of mathematics on a rigorous logical footing. Nobody had ever, everybody knew that geometry had these axioms from Euclid.
Yeah, all the other math before that was fake math. This is pure math.
Well, the idea of axioms that would explain every aspect of mathematics and all the various different branches was a new idea, and it's still ongoing today, I think. It's really, really abstract, but that was an important thing that
I heard
Boole started.
I heard Boole was called the father of symbolic logic, and some people even say he's the founder of pure mathematics, because apparently everything else was not pure enough.
Well, I think I know the people who are saying that, and they're algebraists.
Okay.
They're not analysis people, because that doesn't, pure
that doesn't
mathematics
add up.
is not
or what's
just
the
algebra.
What's the algebraic equivalent of add up?
Add up.
Okay.
But, in some sense, algebra was started with, modern algebra was started with Boole, in some sense. He didn't call it an algebra, by the way. He called it a system of calculus. But algebra, for him,
algebra people.
For him, when he used the word algebra, I think he just meant algebraic manipulation of equations, the way we teach that in
the way I consider algebra.
He wasn't talking about abstract algebra, but that's what he was doing, right? Now we call what he was doing Boolean algebra. It's like a whole model of something. Usually it's some numbers or some kind of thing, but he was modeling something else. Like he said, his book was called The Laws of Thought. That's what he thought he was doing.
Okay, what else did this guy do?
Let's talk about his family. I think we spent way too much time on the math. I tried to be brief, but I wasn't brief.
Okay, well, let's talk about Boole himself. So he moved to Ireland. He did not really like Ireland.
He didn't? Oh,
yeah, he was like, there's not...
The weather was bad?
Let's see what he said. Yeah, he was not a fan of the weather. He wrote to De Morgan wrote to him, "How are you liking Ireland?" And Boole wrote back, "I have seen enough of it." And then he later writes, "There is absolutely no person in this country except my wife with whom I ever speak on the subject of logic. I feel like this is one of the many drawbacks of living in this country." Apparently the Irish were not logical enough for him. He was kind of...
He had few peers. He really did.
There weren't a lot of... The center of math was not Ireland back then. It was London, right? Or Europe, continental Europe.
Boy, in 1840, 50... Yeah, it was probably England and Paris. I'm not sure. Later it became Germany.
His wife, he said he spoke logic with his wife, and his wife was like this huge math nerd. She was super passionate about math psychology, which was how to get, I guess, your mind in the mindset for math and logic.
Mm-hmm.
So she was really into like early child's education with math and how it was failing. And I guess the Victorians had this system of just kind of like drilling everything into these pupils and having them repeat things over and over again, and not a lot of creativity in math education. And she was not very happy with that. She wrote like thousands of pages on every different subject, especially after Boole died. She helped edit his books as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they actually met because she basically begged Boole to be her math tutor. Then she moved away, and they flirted for like 5 or 6 years just over mathematics. Like, they just wrote to each other, and they weren't even writing like love letters. They were just writing about math. And then her father dies. She becomes basically destitute overnight, no money whatsoever. And Boole was like, I love this woman. I am going to marry her. And he immediately steps in, and they just have, by all means, like a really happy marriage.
Well, I don't know why you're scowling. It sounds like a perfect romance to me.
I know for a fact that your wife would not say the same.
So his wife was named Mary
Everest
Boole, right? And her uncle, is this right? Her uncle is the famous George Everest, who Mount Everest is named after.
Yeah, he actually did not want Mount Everest named after him because you can't write the word Everest in Hindi.
Oh.
It's not pronounceable in that language. And he was like, we have to find a native name for Everest or make something else up. And they couldn't find a native name, but he was like, don't use my name because I want it to be able to be pronounced by the people of the region.
Yes, because if the British were known for anything, it's respecting Indian culture. So they went ahead and of course, it had a name. It had a Hindu name, and they renamed it Mount Everest in his honor. But he never climbed it. He was just an important official, an important British official in India. He did some kind of huge
I don't think
surveying
he actually
project.
He did a surveying project. I don't think he actually was. He never saw the mountain that was named after him.
I've read that too. Anyway, that was Mary Everest Boole.
Yeah,
and she wrote this math book for children that actually was pretty popular. Long after he died, right? Her husband died.
She did a lot after her husband died. She lived
a long time after Boole died.
I think she was...
For 60 years.
She was really young when they married.
Yeah.
There was a considerable age difference there. So she lived a long time after Boole died. But they seem to have been... Boole seems to have been basically like an exemplary guy. A little eccentric. But he... At one point, when Mary first met Boole, she asked this woman in Cork, hey, what's this professor of mathematics like? And this woman replies, oh, he's like the sort of man you would trust your daughter with.
Very proper.
Just seems very proper, like bring home to mom and dad sort of guy. Mary says, oh, he must be like a favorite among everyone. And this woman says, oh, he's no favorite of mine. I don't enjoy his society. And Mary is like, okay, why? And she goes on and she's like, he's just so pure and holy. You just feel really bad with him because I don't feel as good about myself. He's just so nice that it makes me feel bad about myself. He's really good with children. Boole apparently used to strike up conversations with people like in shops and stuff, and if he found them really smart, he would just take them home and have dinner parties with them and talk about like optics or telescopes and all these different things. Like, by all means, Boole was like a really great guy. Yeah, Boole was a little religious. Boole's death. Let's talk about Boole's death.
Oh, yeah, it's just sort of a famous story.
So it was raining in Ireland, as it does, and Boole was walking to class. He had something like a 3-mile walk. He gets to class all soaked. He does a lecture. He walks back. It's still raining. He's really soaked. And he gets pneumonia, right? Mary Everest was raised as a child in France with this guy named, I'm not sure what he's named, but he was the father of homeopathy.
Oh.
Is that how you pronounce it? Homeopathy?
Yeah.
Which is a bullshit science. It's like cures like, as long as you dilute it enough or something like that.
So she treated him with more pneumonia.
Yes. Or she tried her hardest. She basically poured ice cold water on his bed sheets and wrapped him in cold sheets, which is exactly how you want to treat pneumonia, I guess.
Oh boy.
It did not work. Spoiler alert. And he died a few days later, probably because he was freezing cold in ice cold sheets, and it was not a good situation.
The second thing that really stands out about Boole, besides being a very great mathematician, is his family. He has this amazing family, right? He has a wife who publishes a mathematical textbook and is a kind of a pioneer in math education, in education generally. And he has 5 daughters, all 5 of which have very interesting stories. And he even has a grandson that's like a mathematician, who's a notable mathematician.
And I think his great-grandson or great-great-grandson is alive today, and I think he won the Turing Award.
Oh, okay. Let's talk about that later.
2 years ago. I don't know anything about that, but his great-grandson is one of the biggest pioneers in deep learning today. This is a family dynasty that just is still going on.
Well, obviously, George Boole had a very, very big brain with a lot of
good genetics.
A lot of good genes that got passed down many times.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about his daughters?
He had a whole bunch of successful daughters. One of them became a successful chemist.
Mm-hmm.
One of them married a polygamist and then got exiled to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
One of them wrote a really successful book called The Gadfly, I think. And it was based on her experience with this man who was a spy, really successful spy.
He was actually a spy for several different countries.
He was a spy for 4 different countries. And he was such a good spy that they think that James Bond is based off of him. Yeah, and she had an affair with that guy who wrote a really successful book based on the experience. And then he had another daughter that was a mathematician, and she was really good at visualizing the 4th dimension. She could just see a tesseract in her mind, or wrote a few papers and coined the term polytope.
Which is just a solid in 4 or more dimensions.
Yeah.
Like the way Platonic solids are in 3 dimensions. So that was Alice, or Alicia, right? The mathematician. The novelist was Ethel. Her name was Ethel Lillian Voynich. She was the one who wrote The Gadfly. And she did have this affair with James Bond. But there's also something else interesting about her. She married a guy who was a rare book collector, and he
has this book called the Voynich Manuscript.
Yeah, he discovered the Voynich Manuscript, and it's really a fascinating book
because nobody knows what it says.
It's all written in code. Every page has very elaborate drawings on it, like illustrations. It's several hundred pages, they believe that there's like 12 pages missing or something, but all the best code breakers have tried and failed to crack this code. And they know there was some extensive like X-ray spectrography. I don't know the word. Crystallography or something that determined it was not a forgery, and it was really, I can't remember, was it 400 years old or something like that? But they determined it was not a forgery. A linguistic analysis determined that it was probably not just gibberish, because it followed certain rules that probably somebody back then could not have just made up. So they think it's a legitimately encoded text, but they have no idea what it means, and it's never been cracked. I mean, like the CIA has tried to crack this thing, and they have failed.
What do you think is in it?
There's some theory that Roger Bacon wrote this, but he doesn't quite match what I read about how old it is. So it was from like Roger Bacon lived in
what do you think the monks were on when they wrote this? It was
supposedly written in 1504 or something. So it's a little too old. I can't remember, but that's she. Ethel has this connection to this famous thing, and then Lucy was the chemist, right? She was the first woman ever to be a fellow of the Royal Institute of Chemistry.
She died an early death, however.
That's true. She never married, right? She couldn't get a job as a teacher, so she was a librarian. She lived with Mary Everett, her mom. She died early.
They had I think, some sort of feud.
Oh, is that
her
right?
Mom and her.
So Mary Ellen was the fourth daughter.
No, I think Mary Ellen was the oldest.
Well, how many daughters have I mentioned? I mentioned Alice, Ethel, Lucy. Okay, so Mary Ellen is 4, and she actually married a mathematician who also specialized in the fourth dimension.
He coined the term tesseract.
That was the tesseract guy, exactly.
And then I think they had a son who invented the juggle gym.
Yes, that's right, Sebastian Hinton.
Or maybe that was a different grandson.
One of Sebastian's daughters was Joan Hinton, and she was also famous. She was a scientist who was one of the few women who worked on the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, she was. And then she became a communist and.
Oh, she's the one that went to China.
Went to Maoist China, I believe. Yeah. Their family has been everywhere.
So Joan Hinton, who is like Boole's great-granddaughter, she actually was observing a nuclear blast. She was like the only woman invited. I think they only had only 10 people were allowed to observe this thing. And she was a direct descendant of George Boole, right? And one of the other 10 people in that room was also a descendant of George Boole, and they didn't even know each other.
Wow.
The other guy was Geoffrey Ingram Taylor. His mother was Margaret Boole Taylor. And so Geoffrey met Joan in this bunker. And they talked, and they're like, "You're descended from George Boole as well?"
Oh my God, me too. How did you know? Wow.
So that's kind of a funny story. And that's everything I know about the daughters. Oh, this book, The Gadfly, it's not really, most people have never heard of it today, but
it was a really famous book.
It was very famous. It was made into an opera, which was scored by none other than Dmitri Shostakovich, I believe, and it was made into a play, which the screenplay was written by none other than George Bernard Shaw. And it was made into several films, I believe. A whole series of films over time. So it was quite the novel. It was not popular in England. Ironically, even though it was about Italy, it was almost never read in Italy, supposedly. But it was very popular in Russia.
In the Russians.
Yeah. It had to do with the fact that it was a kind of, the underlying story was about revolution. And that's George Boole.
So,
and
Dad,
his family, and his famous family.
So, Dad, was George Boole the basis for Jim Moriarty? He looks like Jim Moriarty, and he was a professor at an Irish university that did math.
And Moriarty was supposedly based on an Irish professor of math. He was Moriarty. Because I always thought George Boole was like a huge nerd, but if he was Moriarty, that's like the opposite of a nerd. He was cool.
Okay. So, what did you learn about things related to George Boole that we have not mentioned on this podcast, just for our ending segment?
Well, this is pretty silly, but I was Googling around and I learned that there's a guy named George Boole who's, I think, alive today. He's actually a logician, a mathematician. There's no relation to George Boole. But I mean, Boole is kind of an unusual name. And here's another George Boolos. I mean, it's Boole with an S on the end, I guess. And he's a mathematician who I think is at MIT. I had never heard of him before. No connection, but
okay.
I know it's a pretty random little factoid. What did you learn?
All right, there's a few, mostly from Mary Boole, George Boole's wife, who outlived him by quite a lot. She did some weird stuff. She was not only super into homeopathy, she also believed in something called animal magnetism, which, have you ever heard of animal magnetism?
I've heard of it, but I have no idea.
It's also called mesmerism.
Oh, I've heard of that.
After Franz Mesmer.
That's the animal magnetism and mesmerism are the same thing?
Apparently.
Oh.
Where all humans and animals have some sort of magnetic force flowing through their veins. Mm-hmm. And you can mesmerize someone if you have a certain type of magnetic force.
Oh.
And they have another type of magnetic force. She used this kind of religiously, and she was like, well, this explains Jesus's super magnetism and things like that.
Makes sense.
She had a really interesting life.
The end.
The end.